Does Biden's obfuscation around policies that he pledged to change, whether that's the Saudi war in the Yemen or changes to Trump administration's policies around mandatory sentencing, mean that nothing really changes in politics, that real power lies with a deep state inaccessible to democratic process, meaning that there is little point in voting because whoever you vote for, you get the same deep state? On my podcast, Under the Skin from Luminary, I spoke to Glenn Greenwald, and this was one of the subjects I was keen to explore with him, as he is such a brilliant, prize-winning, and bold journalist. Let's have a listen to him here.
One of the, I think, most interesting facts about the American polity that almost never gets discussed is the non-voter, the percentage of Americans who decide that voting is not worthwhile. So if you are a journalist or you're an activist and you say, look, I don't really think the differences between Republicans and Democrats are sufficiently compelling to make it even worthwhile to support one of them, I'm going to support a third party or I'm going to abstain. The instant accusation is that that's a viewpoint that comes from privilege.
What I'm referring to, and let's face it, I've been down this road before.
When did you last vote?
Never.
You've never ever voted?
No, do you think that's really bad? I remember it caused a lot of controversy when in the United Kingdom I revealed that I'd personally never voted and that my reasons for never voting was that I didn't believe that either parties represented the values and intentions that I had. And actually, even now, I can't believe that it was regarded as such a controversial and, what do I want to say, sort of taboo, almost blasphemous, like a kind of cultural apostasy. Like, no, this is important. Like, people died for that. I remember it now very clearly, and I remember at the time thinking, no, they didn't die for the dumb act of voting. They died for freedom, for democracy, for their beliefs, for their personal connections to these important ideals. I suppose what I'm interested in is voting meaning something, making voting mean something. Now, I was younger then, and I was not so clear and hopefully articulate, but as I am now. But what I sensed was true, and I feel like a lot of people agreed with me, was that big business and the government act in collaboration with one another in order to achieve a type of stasis. And while you may achieve certain cultural and even economic differences that may be meaningful to some people, by and large, the ability of the powerful to conduct their pursuits, to pursue their interests, remains unimpeded. Some further information with regard to the current American administration. In the last couple of weeks, we've learned that Joe Biden, despite running on a platform that included an end to mandatory minimum sentencing, is now extending the Trump-era policy of expanding mandatory minimum sentencing to cover a range of fentanyl-related substances. And that fentanyl, that's got a big connection to Big Pharma. That's a drug that's been pushed out there. The reason that people are even taking fentanyl, a painkiller, is because they're in pain, and the reason they're in pain is because of the collapse of society. And I remember how the Democrats framed this issue under Trump. It's like, oh, what a wasteland, this opioid nightmare that Trump's presiding over.
There should be no minimum mandatories in the law. No one should be going to jail because they have a drug problem. They should be going to rehabilitation, not to jail. We should fundamentally change the system, and that's what I'm going to do.
And now look at what we're seeing. Now, as you know, I am pan-political. I don't believe in any of this stuff. Perhaps I never did. But it seems to me that expanding mandatory minimum sentencing to cover a range of fentanyl-related substances is not a vastly different way of handling that problem. In fact, it's the same way. It's not different at all. Also, with regard to foreign policy, it was revealed that more than 2 months after saying he would end all American support for offensive operations in the war in Yemen, his administration has yet to offer any specifics on participation in the Saudi-led war. So, I suppose those are just two areas that demonstrate a kind of continuum between the two parties, but you would also only need to look at the way they're funded, the kind of open doors that exist between the financial world, the big tech world, and the Democratic Party to see how these machines actually function. Glenn Greenwald, though, has a lifetime's experience operating at the forefront of these kind of explorations and this type of analysis. Let's see what he's saying.
That because you're so privileged, you're wealthy, you're powerful, you're shielded from bigotry, you have the luxury to do that, but that people who are poor, people who are discriminated against, people who are marginalized don't have that privilege. The reality is the exact opposite. If you look at the profile of the non-voter, they're overwhelmingly and disproportionately poor and people of color. They're deciding, now, probably in some cases there are some obstacles that have been put in their way to vote, but it's not that hard to vote, even to register to vote and then to go vote. The lines are too long, they should be shorter, but people who want to go vote can vote. They're choosing not to vote. And there's a lot of polling data that polls non-voters and says, why don't you vote? They don't say the lines are too long or all these obstacles have been put. They say, because I don't give a fuck. I don't think it matters. I don't care. It doesn't affect my life.
In a sense, freedom could be defined as the ability to operate beyond the reach of the state, not impeded by the economic necessities of the society we live in, i.e. you've got to have enough money to create a little bit of distance, otherwise you're going to require the state or you won't be able to participate in society. That shows you how limited freedom has become. The idea that you could sort of set up your own system of living, your own kind of self-reliance and self-governance, you could step outside of the web of interests that constitute modern society, seems almost fantastical. And I'm kind of reminded of the conversation I had with Edward Snowden, also on Under the Skin, where it became clear that in order to have privacy, you have to live like a criminal.
They have embedded tracking code in all of the dumbest apps on your phone. From big to small. Instagram obviously is a tracking nightmare, but so is your weather app, so is your calculator, so is any kind of little shim they can get into your device.
I.e., just take the example of your phone that's constantly spying on you. If you wanted to end that, halt that, you'd either have to not have a phone and just use phone boxes, like a criminal, or you'd have to get someone else to buy you a phone, registered in their name, use that phone for a while, throw it away. You'd have to live like that. That's just to have privacy. Otherwise, you have to assume you're being spied upon. I think this could be applied to other areas of freedom, that you have no choice but to participate. Like, a census arrived through my door recently. You've got to fill this out. Why? Why? Who are you? Who are you? Why do you need a census from me? You've got to earn money. You've got to pay tax. You've got to do all these things. And how do they sort of frame that? Yeah, but taxes, it's for hospitals and roads and children. Oh yeah, where do we live? Hospitals and roads and children land, is it? Or do you think that there are foreign wars that you don't agree with? Unaddressed financial indiscrepancies in the city? Major corruption? Sleaze everywhere? What do you think? What do you think's going on? How about a society where you determine what your community taxes from individual incomes, where you decide how those resources are spent, where you vote for it? This has been tried out in some areas, but of course these kind of political experiments are hugely opposed by the dominator culture, so it's difficult. Like, you don't see a lot of experimentation around the benefits of certain substances or plants, say, that are easily accessible, that have health benefits, because big pharma companies aren't investigating whether or not there are cheap, easy, natural solutions to psychological problems. And in the same way, the government, the state, the corporate state are not investigating alternative political means because they like this one. They want this one to continue to work. That's why people that are disinterested in politics, don't believe in politics, have no faith in politics, are maligned and criticised, because that amounts to political apostasy, because it's saying one of the things you're not allowed to say. Don't matter who you vote for, you're going to get the same kind of results. You're going to get a strongly hierarchical, elitist culture that doesn't care about the vast majority of the population except as to how it can subjugate them, while powerful interests continue to be pursued uninhibited.
Do you know in 2016, after the shock of Trump's victory, one of the states Trump won that Hillary was expected to win was Wisconsin. So the New York Times actually published a really good article. They went to Milwaukee, which is a heavily African-American city that typically votes overwhelmingly Democrat. And they analyzed the reason Hillary lost Wisconsin was because so many black voters who had voted in previous elections for Obama stayed at home. And they went and they asked them, knowing now that Trump won, in part because you decided to stay at home, do you regret that choice? And to a person, they all said, absolutely not. I don't regret it in the slightest. In fact, I only voted for Obama kind of out of like racial obligation. He didn't do shit for our lives. And I sure as hell wasn't going to go do that for Hillary. This is like the unspoken fact that just is disappeared because it's such a revealing fact about the two parties. If you only interview and speak to and hear from the people who believe that there are these really radical differences between the parties, that it's a battle between good and evil, if you only hear from them, it'll seem like that's true because you've just excluded everybody else, millions and millions of people, not a tiny fringe, millions and millions of people who think exactly the opposite.
That's partly the imperative of this channel, is to explore ideas that are not cosseted, curated and controlled by dominant mainstream narratives. The idea that we're only discussing the difference between here and here. What about all of this unexplored territory? What about all of the unexplored potentialities, all the ways that individuals, collectives and groups might live life? This is the real challenge to the mainstream. From some of the conversations I've had recently, it seems that the Democrat Party were more pleased to have a term of Trump than to have Bernie Sanders as that candidate. What does that tell you? It tells you that it doesn't even really matter to them, that their entrenched systems of belief are more important than what happens to ordinary people, whether that's in America or this country or wherever. So for me, the important thing for us to communicate about, for us to change the way that we feel, to change the way that we live, are these issues that are not covered, not explored, that are precluded, dampened, controlled.
Ultimately, yeah, there are differences between the parties. I mean, you can't deny that there are differences. I mean, they have differences on cultural debates and the like, but on the questions of foreign policy, militarism, capitalism, the working class, there are really no differences at all. They're funded by exactly the same power centers. And, it's become this kind of stigmatized taboo view to talk about the existence of a deep state in the United States, even though there so obviously is one. If you just pick up any book of the Cold War, Devil's Chessboard or the Jakarta Method, there's several really good ones. That whole thing was created on purpose to be a secret power center that exercised dominion and hegemony regardless of the outcome of elections. You can have a Republican, you can have a Democrat, and the CIA gets what they want, the Pentagon gets what they want, the Wall Street gets what it wants, and now increasingly Silicon Valley gets what it wants.
We're like children choosing our pets' names. I'd like to call it Charlie. No way are you calling it Charlie. We're calling it Moondog. Please, Charlie. Okay, we'll call it Charlie. You're in charge.
So what media outlets will do is focus on the small areas where there are differences, culture war differences. They'll exaggerate other differences to make it seem like you have this, like democracy is this incredibly messy, free for all, where there's all kinds of divergent views and there's tons of freedom everywhere in the discourse. And they achieve that by just eliminating and never talking about the incredibly consequential and ample policies where both parties agree, and by excluding from the discourse people who just say, I don't think there are any differences and therefore I don't participate.
I like how Glenn Greenwald said there are clearly differences around certain cultural issues, but I was told before that in all the areas where the dominant parties agree, in those areas you have no choice at all. So that's an exploration you can easily undertake for yourself. Where do the two dominant parties, because it's going to be one of those two, where do they agree? In those areas there's no choice at all. Then as a further experiment, why don't you look at your own life and the things that are affecting you, and why don't you take a moment in silent reflection to consider what kind of life you personally would like to live, and why you have foregone those dreams, why you've accepted that it's ridiculous even to contemplate things like that and it's not possible. Well, the reason you think it's not possible is because those kind of ideas have been excluded from the debate. Of course power is complicated, of course building a civilization is complicated, of course we should be careful before casting aside civilization to begin things anew. But what I'm suggesting is not really that radical at all. It's more of a return to the way we lived for hundreds and thousands of years, with the new advances in medicine and technology, and with an awareness of our tendency to exploit power. Most importantly of all, though, it seems to me that we have to become alert to information, that we can no longer afford to tribalize data when we consume it, that we have to be circumspect, skeptical, cynical, even sometimes, about the agenda of the people and platforms behind the information we receive. If you're enjoying this conversation, even if you think that I'm doing a bit too much of the talking, why don't you like and subscribe and comment? I read the comments. I'm well up for a chat with you. Or go over to russellbrand.com and sign up for my mailing list there. If you want to hear the rest of that conversation with with Glenn Greenwald. It's out in a couple of days, but if you subscribe now, you can listen to Jordan Peterson, Edward Snowden, Vandana Shiva. There's some fantastic episodes. Thank you very much for watching this. Give it a like and subscribe. Helps us out. Cheers.